So today we keep looking at some political, religious, and cultural aspects in Ukrainian history between essentially the Lublin Union of 1569 and the mid-17th century. As we have seen yesterday, the Lublin Union essentially separated historically the southern lands of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, properly what we call Ukraine today, at the time, or still known as the Old Rus, to be incorporated in the Kingdom of Poland, which produced essentially a Polonization, local culture, that we will see better today, in fact, and increased also a divide between the elite that was the local elite that was more involved in the Commonwealth and international policy, and the peasants, right? That fundamentally, and also the gentry in a way, because the situation in Eastern Europe was different from Poland, socially speaking, and this produced some important, from one side, the westernization of Ukrainian elite at that point, but also the increasing distance with the rest of the populace, and which would trigger some rebellions. We will see in another time. Right, this process was not perfectly smooth. As we've seen, there were some Ukrainian oligarchs who opposed themselves to the process of Polonization, in part. Essentially, we have seen it through the Lublin Union and eventually the Brest one of 1596, with the latter's creation of the Uniat Church, essentially. Before between in fact the 1596 and say the 30s of the 17th century, the Uniat Church represented, because of the work of Rome and Warsaw and the Jesuits, the reunification of the Orthodox Church of the Old Rus, that at that point was representing still an important international point of reference for Orthodox, given that Constantinople was under the Ottomans and the Muscovites had acquired the metropolitic seat of Rus in kind of shady ways, and still there was an enormous conflict ongoing, right, between the Commonwealth, especially Russia, but also the Ottomans in the process. And while Ukrainians essentially believed that this could bring to some, and as it would happen in part, to some recognition, institutional recognition of their church, on the other hand, this was done at the conditions of the Vatican and of Poland, and it somewhat contributed to the decline of the same old Slavonic culture that at that point was already, telling the truth, as we've seen, unhinged from not just from the population in general, but not even the Ukrainian clergy used it formally anymore. But this reduced properly the negotiable power at a certain point of the same church, right? So some Ukrainian oligarchs that had instead sponsored the revival of Old Slavonic to try to put it at the same level of Latin in with this broader process of Catholic affirmation, took literally arms, right, to defend partly their prerogatives. Others even sided with the Protestants, as we'll see today, so in an still anti-Catholic fashion against Poland in that context, while Lithuania also was being secured, let's say, in a Catholic sense. At this point they were converted to Catholicism from a couple of centuries, but still ever more with the consolidation of Polish power. So this is the broader frame in the period that we can identify as Renaissance for Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine, in the same way. Naturally, Eastern Europe received these influences in a lesser way than other countries, but it's still important to observe how the essentially the oligarchic nature of these societies contributed to a great international opening of the elites, specifically, which occurred also in Ukraine. So in Poland, the educated classes began to, at this point, paradoxically, to shift, let's say, in their state and literary language, let's say, from Latin to vernacular Polish. This was important because, aside from the philological revival, in fact, still Latin remained of dramatic importance, etc., the westernized Poland, let's say, had some important received importantly some aspects of what had cultural aspects indirectly of what had been the Reformation. And so the idea that the people now also developing in towards a modern direction would and could express themselves in the vernacular language and in the various fields of socio-economical activities. In the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, there was something similar, albeit in favor of Polish as properly the foreign language, given that up to that point Lithuanians had been using in their government still Chancery Slavonic, which was in a sense was close to the vernacular of the country, of much of the country at least, because as we've seen historically, Lithuania had incorporated these enormous Ruthenian lands, including probably the ones of the Rus, altogether that spoke Slavic languages differently from Lithuanian, that, as you know, is a very peculiar language on its own. Doesn't belong to the Slavic branch. But the majority of the people up to that point had adopted this kind of more, simpler bureaucratic written language that favored, in a sense, the idea of the opening also to another vernacular, right, the one of the bigger Polish state, which essentially was imported in Lithuania as the statal and literary language. And this is important because Belarusian and Lithuanian vernaculars were essentially, in fact, the most spoken languages, would decline in political and cultural relevance within the Commonwealth properly. This can be explained in part of the same reasons that you can find in Ukraine, in a way, but as we will see now, with an important political divide, because Lithuanian gentry maintained more rights, more prerogatives than the Ukrainian one. And there was a specific reason also of markedly economic importance that we will see now. So, in fact, the same goes for Ukraine. The same goes for Ukrainian vernacular. There was no elevation of it, or as we've seen of the Church Slavonic in some, broader political, cultural guise. Polish came to overrun. And whereas in Poland the answer to the language question brought letters closer to common speech, because Polish permeated the state after Latin at that point. In Lithuania and Ukraine, the local vernacular essentially began to be abandoned properly by the elites, and so also by those who would sponsor a local culture, right? This is true both in the lay and the ecclesiastical elite, leaving essentially just the commoners and simpler activities, lower activities to be to see it used. And the reason, in a sense, was obvious. There were two orders of reasons. The first one is, let's say, the kind of oligarchic character of Eastern European societies in general, right? Poland had a stronger gentry than Lithuania or the old Rus. and therefore the elite would have just an ever greater, let's say, education compared to the rest of the people, a greater political power, let's say in a way that this gap could not really be bridged and would just go in favor of the same elite. The other was the further incorporation, as we've seen, of Ukraine within Poland, and therefore of the Ukrainian elite in the Commonwealth's policy, in a way that naturally would bring the necessity for them to adequate to the standards of the ruling country to be able to profit from it. And naturally this derived also from the cooperation in the exploitation of the same country's resources in an ever more oligarchic sense. It would be easier for Poland to essentially operate together with few and ever stronger oligarchs, which was the same policy attempted with the Polish szlachta itself, right? The also Poland as a central European country, after all, as many others that we have seen in the region, was essentially marked by this essentially weak monarchy. The idea that the country was still basically, the king ruled in an area around the capital, had important assets and so on, but fundamentally the rest of the country would be parceled among the very powerful oligarchs who literally had their own armies, waged their own wars, had make their own policy, right? Something very different from the process of modern state building that was occurring in Western Europe, where fundamentally the nobility was being gradually curbed, albeit still integrated, of course, in the process of concentration of power from the monarchic side. So it was naturally important for the Ukrainian nobility, but not in open opposition to the same Commonwealth centralizing policy, to secure their own status in this social sense. This was also the age of Reformation, and since the beginning of it, many Ukrainian nobles, like many Polish ones, in order to escape this centralizing policy and aggrandize themselves, had converted to Protestantism. So literally many, but also not just among the nobility, probably Ukrainian gentry, had converted from Orthodoxy to different types of Protestantism during the course of the 16th century. So in the Commonwealth, as you know, the Protestantism would be curbed, essentially. There were important islands that were also present in Lithuania, largely in Poland around Lublin. That's why the 1569 agreement also took that city in consideration, because it had been the center of Protestantism, and that the monarchy was at this point subjugating. As a consequence, Catholicism, as we've seen before, began to spread and consolidate all over the Commonwealth without too many troubles. Considering that the two main, the two countries that made it were effectively Catholic. Ukrainians were Orthodox, as we've seen. So, in all this, also the Counter-Reformation had helped a big deal with the Council of Trent, the massive papal efforts to counter-strike Protestantism, which were successful in Poland, so much that essentially you can argue that the children and grandchildren of those Polish noblemen who had converted to Protestantism would essentially brought back into Roman Catholicism in the following generations. And the main difference in this regard is that while the Poles were fundamentally coming back to be the religion that from half of a millennium that they had always followed, for Ukrainians it was different, because the nobility, at that point followed the main Commonwealth trend. Many Ukrainian noblemen converted to Catholicism. This would make them ever more separated as a consequence from the rest of the population, the peasantry, that was fundamentally all Orthodox, and was, as we've seen, ever more excluded, and consequently also ever less understanding of these broader mechanisms, because it simply equated, as we will see now, to simply lose ever greater personal freedom in the process. So, as a consequence, the Polonization of Ukraine was ever stronger at the elite level, both for language and Catholicism. And there was also a change in this regard of Commonwealth's policy towards the same orthodoxy, in a sense, because paradoxically, in the 30s of the 17th century, the Uniate Church was fundamentally abandoned, right? The Uniate Church had been created in 1596, as we've seen, to, as a broader recomposition of the Great Schism between Western and Eastern Christianity, as far as this case Ukrainians were concerned. But after this elite consolidation and conversion to Catholicism, the same Commonwealth didn't actually care more than much if now the peasantry in Ukraine was Orthodox or not. So while the Uniate Church went on historically becoming a minority, and it would be significantly involved actually as a platform, at least for the development of a modern Ukrainian national identity, Orthodoxy was made legal again, even outside of the Uniate Church, that instead, in fact, as we just said, declined properly as a minority. It was properly not needed anymore. Most of the nobility was not interested in that, and those were essentially the first ones that had promoted that, both as a lay and an ecclesiastical elite. The peasantry, as we've seen, whether they had been Orthodox or Catholic, they would have not essentially created a problem in that regard. Important was for the elite to maintain the grip on the country. And naturally, this brought, however, to the increasing difference of Ukraine further from the rest of the Commonwealth, because while Lithuania had essentially converted to Catholicism very late, historically, for European standards, but still without essentially swings towards Orthodoxy at that point, and so had consolidated this confession, Ukraine remained Orthodox, essentially, right? Lithuanian nobles and peasants were Catholic. Ukrainian nobles were now Catholic, but the peasants were Orthodox. And an important difference is that while the old statutes of Lithuania were recognized politically, institutionally, and juridically in the Commonwealth, so that the Lithuanian gentry was fundamentally protected by them, and their rights recognized within the system, the Ukrainian gentry was not, because they were less developed than the Lithuanian one. They had simply a different status in the broader political balance of the Commonwealth. There were less, right? There was properly also a demographic difference. At least those who could qualify could be, wealthy enough to even have a political weight in that sense. And the nobility ruled everything, right? This was a quite important difference as well, that favored naturally such situation. This went greatly in favor of the Poles as well, because now Ukraine fell within the kingdom's border, and it allowed the Polish nobility to intervene also in the country, entrepreneurially, just bonding also with the Ukrainian nobility and so on. And given that the grain exports of Ukraine were becoming already at the time quite important in the international trade, especially exports to Western Europe from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at this point were a big thing. The interest for essentially consolidating this political social control over the local peasantry was shared both by the Polish and Ukrainian nobility. And so while the Lithuanian gentry maintained their landholdings that were protected by the 1569 Union Charter, etc., Lithuanian statutes remained the highest law within the country. And in 1588, a new statute also was established to protect such rights further. In Ukraine, there was none of this. Right? After 1569, Polish families gained an enormous amount of land in Ukraine. This brought also to the further introduction of Polish and Jewish culture in the process, because this happened essentially by still the injection of new great lords, of powerful landowners within Ukraine herself, and this were entire courts practically, right? They were very rich people, and they brought with them Polish and Jewish soldiers and assistants, broadly speaking. The Polish hirelings brought also to naturally a modernization of the local economy in a sense, but still in an exploitative way, right? Essentially, true latifundia were consolidated. Jewish administrators came mostly from the Polish crown lands, and they were a tradition. The Jewish community was quite consistent in Poland already at the time, historically, and this happened in Western Slavic countries that centralized greatly relatively to their possibilities because of the cooperation with the Jewry that point in Europe came mostly from the east, from the collapse of the Khazar Empire, that were allowed money lending and other practices, and so the Polish crown relied heavily on these agents, right? And so this system engineered further the organization of the Ukrainian countryside. The demographics we were talking about before, by the 60s of the 17th century, perhaps only one person out of 50 in Ukraine was noble, right? In Poland, instead, one person out of 10 was, right? Now, I don't know exactly the data, how the nobility here is measured in practice, but the proportion is still very meaningful, if anything, from a status point of view. Because if one person out of 10 is considered nobility in Poland, well, it means that doesn't matter how many of these people are actually, noble in the sense there is still a stratification within this type of nobility, but it's meaningful that their status is recognized as such legally, because otherwise it wouldn't even be recorded in the first place as nobility. Instead, Poland, and this was something that in Polish history in fact remained for a long time, had fundamentally this gentry, right, that was considered properly noble. This is a bit like, I don't know, in the early 16th century in Castile, that 1/3 of the male population was considered as hidalgos, the nobility properly, because of the struggle, the Reconquista, because of course these people mostly were actually not very affluent at all. They were not even of particularly high status, but still they retain importantly such prerogatives, right? And so Ukraine at this point displayed instead a largely subservient population, as most of Eastern Europe fundamentally was. Like in Muscovy was practically the same, in the same Lithuania, actually, the situation was similar, right? There were just the boyars, largely as great magnates, but still, some prerogatives were recognized because the social spectrum was a bit more balanced. The more in Poland, where of course the average per capita wealth was higher than these other countries of the Commonwealth. Part of the reason, in general, also aside from the size, etc., why Poland was strong. It was the most advanced country and could enforce this control on other weaker society. Like, it's not a good sign where there are very, 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 very few rich people and very, 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 very few people. In essence, there is not a middle class, right? And this, of course, takes place only in infrequent circumstances historically, right? There is a moment in which there is a middle class that makes this dramatic effort, is cohesive, has common interest and mass, and achieves the things. Then eventually there is a stagnation of some sort. People go down largely in status, and there's just an oligarchy that maybe is able, takes over and rules, etc., but also tends to remain entrenched in its own prerogatives at the point that its own cohesion, also in the face of countries that are more, more powerful in that regard, in that more solid middle class cohesive orientation will eventually take over. And this is exactly what would happen to Poland with the partitions later on, right? These were countries where the oligarchy was so powerful that eventually the monarchy was aborted in the process, right? It lost any meaningful power, and therefore the state was just out there to be sold, right? In any case, this is in fact the same dynamic that happened instead within the Commonwealth between Poland and Ukraine. So the local gentry took on Polish ways, and Jews took up their leases, right? The Orthodox peasantry passed essentially from poverty to indigence on many occasions. There was one same Ukrainian Jew, Nathan of Hanover, who graduated at the Yeshiva of Ostro. He was a famous chronicler, right? And compared the suffering of the Ukrainian peasants to the ones of the Jews under the Egyptian rule. And the Ukrainians, he wrote, quote, were looked upon as lowly and inferior beings, and became the slaves and handmaids of the Polish people and the Jews, which is quite meaningful. This was said just by a Jew himself. So, because these were foreign Jews for Ukrainians that had a Jewish population themselves. Now, the intense social stratification brought to this state of affairs, but at the same time, as we're remembering at the beginning, opened Ukrainian elite a big deal to international culture. This was the age of Renaissance. As we've seen, there were literally Polish magnates who arrived together with all their courts. And there were social relations, of course. There were marriages between the Polish and Ukrainian elite. Polish women brought this court life and manners. The Italian Renaissance at this point had flowed into Poland, also largely thanks to the Italian princess Bona Sforza, who was wife of Sigmund I and mother of Sigmund II, by the way. Again, these countries had received a milder influence of the Renaissance, because they were, even here, mostly receptive as far as the elites were concerned. But Central Europe, Eastern Europe was less, say, because the middle classes were less developed, also had a more reduced rate, at least of modernization in that context. Thus, it was mostly a Polish filter renaissance that spread in Ukraine. It did, however, occur concretely, right? The Ukrainian magnates organized their own courts. Also, they married in the Polish nobility, and they became ever more involved with the mechanisms of the Commonwealth. With the paradox that after the Lublin Union, many Ukrainian oligarchs were somewhat more Polish than many of the Polish ones, in a sense. And also the same Ukrainian culture brought some contribution in the Polish high culture. In spite of the growing problems that were starting to emerge, however, within the country, and chiefly because of the peasant conditions that were also mixed with this broader cultural ones that we have seen, and which we will see on another occasion. So thank you for listening. See you next time.